of Cary Grant in a dress for this talk, and I couldn't find it. I think it's in Bringing Up Baby that he opens a door wearing a dress, jumps up in the air and says, "The whole world's gone gay." But nobody whom I had breakfast with believes this, and I couldn't find it anywhere last night or this morning on the internet. I hope that's sort of the only fantastical, mad remark that I'll make today. So what I thought I'd do was to talk a wee bit about this question of the relationship between cultural policy and creative industries and like where they came from. And I wanted to put up the exact quotation from the great and glorious rightist adventurist with which we began the other week, Ronald Reagan, and what it was that he said at the University of Spoilt Children in 1966 as part of his gubernatorial bid to oust the much-beloved father of the freeway system, Edmund Pat Brown, father of Moonbeam. This is what he said. So you've got it up there. And so you know what he looked like when he said it. I found that there are two pictures of former governor, former president, late Ronald Reagan on the internet. Who knew there would be as many as two? And these were the two that I was able to grab. This is one of his farewell addresses as the president, and this is what he was dressed in at USC when he gave his gubernatorial address. I find it rather fetching, personally. So, where did all this bollocks come from? Not moving right along. The humanities/liberal arts have long formed one of the cores, or at least been at the core, of the educational system of the so-called West, but lots of post-colonial countries as well. Why was this? There are all kinds of reasons, and they vary somewhat geographically and historically and ecclesiastically, but in part they're to do with the idea that the humanities could reach the quintessence of subjectivity. And what did that mean in pragmatic terms? That the humanities had, or liberal arts, depending on which continent you're on, the peculiar virtues of producing politicians, civil servants, imperial administrators, and legislators, because they could in some sense incarnate and index the arcane wisdom of both the Enlightenment and the establishment. And this worked as a very powerful mode of organization, particularly in Western Europe, throughout the late 19th century and the first part of the 20th. But it was really rocked by the emergence of industrial societies and the two world wars, which in many ways shattered the confidence of humanists in their capacity to lead. And the so-called crisis of the humanities, people kept saying, David said yesterday, when has there not been such a crisis? The so-called crisis of the humanities begins in the period of what was often called the white heat of technology, the moment right after the Second World War, when it seemed as though physicists, for example, were new gods, when the atom would bring peace, and when advances in applied science were so extraordinary that it seemed as though for many in educational areas there was little future for the humanities. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to the production of the ruling class, the reproduction of the ruling class at most, for instance, US universities, i.e. not the state universities, but the big northeastern universities and the big liberal arts colleges, or the famous liberal arts colleges. This is about, in many ways, the recreation of the great books tradition as per Chicago and Columbia. But in many other parts of the educational establishment, reproducing office classes, producing teachers and so on, there was a real crisis of confidence in the sense that knowledge should be more applied than it had been hitherto. The rise after the war of big science and the rise of big post-colonialism, plus the emergence of the ICTs that Zhao talked about yesterday, the information and communication technologies, things that I would prefer to call cultural technologies and within which I would include textual categories like genre. The emergence of these ICTs or cultural technologies has increased this sense of crisis, along of course with a massive crisis in the question of value. Not just value in pragmatic terms, but value in terms of what gets into that canon. And we've seen that in debates over the so-called Western canon and the dead white European male issue. Well, it seems to me that the latter-day emergence of cultural policy studies and creative industries discourse is an attempt to answer this sort of persistent dilemma: how do you make the humanities relevant? Have you all received the piece that I sent to Irena to send out yesterday that I wrote about how to define the cultural industries versus the creative industries? You didn't get that. Could somebody go to Irena and ask her to send that out? Oh, we'll try and see if it's... Yes, could someone quickly just look on the web and see if it's posted? Yeah, it's a piece in the next issue of Cultural Studies coming out next month. I thought it would help in the context of the discussion of how to define these things. If someone could check, and if it's not there, could somebody... Okay. Linda, would you mind just asking... Oh, you go? Okay, thanks. So, it seems to me that the cultural policy studies, creative industries discourse is an attempt to make the humanities relevant. How? Well, frequently, as we've seen, I think, in our discussions from day one, by buying into human capital doctrines of neoliberalism. By human capital, I mean the notion that we are our own site of investment and that we need to increase our capacities. You find this whether you're reading Gary Becker or Amartya Sen, despite the differences between them, in order to become more capable subjects. Subjects for work, subjects for pleasure, subjects for leisure, subjects for safe and secure retirement. Both elements, in a sense, beaver away to make things explode and to make things travel faster. Right? The sorts of things that applied science is meant to do, make things explode and make things travel faster. Nowadays, cultural policy and creative industries both try to make things explode and make things travel faster, whether this is via first-person shooter games or cultural search engines. I want to look at that, how that came to pass, and so I want to look at how cultural studies spawned both critical cultural policy studies and creative industries discourse. And also look at how the wider economy played into this, and then briefly show you how one might go about critical cultural policy studies analysis with reference to the media, but that'll be very brief. Well, there are all kinds of narratives we could give about cultural studies, of course. One could argue that it started in what became Iran in the 14th century. One could argue that it started in Latin America in the 19th century. There are many, many trajectories. But let's say that in terms of the one that has been dominant in Western Europe and in the United States and is of increasing significance in the Asia-Pacific and has started to be more and more important in Latin America, that tradition, that British tradition, derived in part, and I think it's fed into in recent times in these other sites, a rejection of the traditional humanities' high aesthetic prejudices. So I'm going to suggest that in what we might call its first 3 decades, up until the 1990s, it was characterized by a semiotic insurrectionism. And this semiotic insurrectionism positioned the correct reader of texts as a kind of pacific but vibrant cultural guerrilla. Now, once you've established that you know how to be a pacific but vibrant cultural guerrilla, or how to teach others to be this kind of guerrilla, the next challenge is to find a more practical engagement with the public sphere. And this actually represented, interestingly enough, rather than an evolution, a rearticulation to origins via the foundational figure of Richard Hoggart. How many people here have read anything by Richard Hoggart, articles or essays or books? So quite a few of you. Hoggart was the inaugural director of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, where both Angie and Dick studied, of course. And he published his first and most famous book, this book, The Uses of Literacy, in the same year as C.P. Snow's Two Cultures book came out, 1957, the year before Madonna was born. Now, in many ways, what Hoggart's work did, almost against its own grain, I think, is transcend the left leavism, the anti-Marxist left leavism that characterized both him and Raymond Williams at that time, to connect with Snow, who was much more of a socialist and was in fact a fan of Soviet education, interestingly enough. And Hoggart was particularly adept at moving between different formations, both academic and, in a sense, practical and mediatic, in the same way as activists or consultants or bureaucrats or politicians are. He was part of a tradition that's known in Britain as the great and the good. How many people have heard of this tradition called the great and the good? Okay, so just a couple of you. We have a lot of them in this country. To think of counterparts internationally and in the US, where there are, of course, many who are the great and the good, If you think of the United Nations eminent persons groups, if you think of royal commissions in Canada or Australia, and if you think in the US context of joint bodies that are convened by otherwise vociferously rivalrous groups. So a DC example, a Washington example, would be that the American Enterprise Institute, which is the Republican Party in exile when it's not in power, and the Brookings Institution, which is the Democratic Party in exile when it's not in power, they have a Center for Regulatory Studies, right, which they happily run in concert. And they also run in concert, interestingly enough, a very significant inquiry at the moment into constitutive structural inequality in the US population, a quite remarkable set of documents being prepared by this. What is the idea of the great and the good? It's to blend popular visibility, political bipartisanship, professional expertise, and public interest, to put them all together in bodies that can deliberate on matters of policy without the burden of party loyalty or corporate responsibility. Think of the Iraq Study Group of 2007 as the latest prominent, failed, as they normally are, instance in this country. Hoggett, for example, served on Britain's Pilkington Committee on Broadcasting, which was the key body in the early 60s that set the tone of public policy for the media for 15 years, and which was so radical in its inspirations and its execution that one of the major corporate shareholders in commercial television had a public burning of the document that it produced. And over the next 30 or 40 years, he was prominent in similar inquiries into the arts, into adult education, into youth services, and he went on to become a major UNESCRAT in Brussels. The other thing that he did was give evidence at the obscenity trial that Penguin Books underwent for publishing Lady Chatterley's Lover. And this is David Tennant, Doctor Who, playing Richard Hoggett in a recent British television adaptation of the trial of Lady Chatterley's Lover. As a consequence of doing this work on behalf of Penguin, he gave the famous testimony where he got up and said, "I don't understand why fuck is a problem in a Penguin book when I heard that word used by workers building buildings on my way into the Old Bailey this morning." Raymond Williams also gave evidence, but was not as successful in his use of the colloquial as Hoggett. As a consequence of that testimony, Penguin Books gave him the money to set up the apparently truly leftist, independent Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. It got its early money from Mammon, the private sector, aka Penguin Books. I'm going to leave that up for a while because that's the best looking person on a slide that I have. But the first academic formation of cultural policy studies, you would think it would derive immediately from les mains sales, the dirty hands of Hoggett, actually began some distance from both the physical and intellectual location of cultural studies. It was a bottom-feeding segment of the grotesque positivistic US social sciences as per the 1970s. It developed through a group of professional associations like the Association of Cultural Economics, conferences on economics, social theory and the arts, and evaluations of policies and programs undertaken across a raft of academic sites. Since that time, some of you will be familiar with publications like Arts and Education Policy Review, the wonderfully acronymized JAMLS, or Journal of Arts Management, Law and Society, the Journal of Cultural Economics, lots of others, have investigated the ethical and technical management of the arts and also audience or visitor, in museum terms, preferences. Yankee social science services to state and capital dressed up as objectivity. We're very familiar with this mode, even if we're not familiar with its expression in these venues. My concern is that this instrumental tendency has latterly expanded to overdetermine the critical edge of cultural studies, helping to form creative industries discourse. Now, initially, I want to say that discourse was actually in a productive tension with Hoggett's vision, in ways I'll explain, but now it's overwhelmed his legacy and even claims to incorporate it. I'll return to that, as they say when you're about to land, momentarily. By contrast to empiricist social science, of course, cultural studies had a more overtly political drive, articulated to social movements, articulated to cultural workers' rights. It was animated by subjectivity and power, how human subjects are formed and how they experience cultural and social space. Cultural studies operated under the sign of a commitment to articulate scholarly knowledge to progressive social change. And a nice way of describing the tension between that kind of cultural studies and when you get involved in policy comes from my old friend and landlord, $150 a week in 1989, Stuart Cunningham. No, I was also the ghostwriter of this book. But then I became a big kid, so his next book I was allowed to co-author, which sadly was a total failure, whereas this book, which I ghost wrote, was a massive success. Anyway, this particular paragraph I definitely did not write. But it is a very wonderful and brilliant distillation of his critique of cultural studies and what happens when you move away from the salubrious comforts of theoretical exposition into the dirty groundwork of trying to influence governmentality. It was in a book that he actually did write, but I was the sort of ghost editor or whatever, called Framing Culture. Came out, as it says there, in 1992. Well, he attacks this position that he is enunciating here for failing to acknowledge, for instance, that public action on sexism in advertising or the status of women in the workplace has often come about because of a shift from utopic critique to implemented policy. It's about, of course, forming counter-public spheres and taking them into the public sphere, but it's also about sitting down with policymakers, be they corporate, union, or governmental, and saying, you've got to change the way you do your business, and this is how, and this is where, and this is when, and this is why. So what Cunningham did, and this became a cause célèbre, but he also became the kind of bad kid of cultural studies. It was a massive debate from the late 80s through till, I would say, the mid-90s. He called for cultural studies to displace its revolutionary rhetoric, that's the term he used, with a reformist vocation. That's not vacation for those of us who love August, but vocation. And it would draw new energy and direction, he thought, from what he called a social democratic view of citizenship and the trainings necessary to activate and motivate it. This engagement with policy would avoid a politics of a status quo while providing a sense of real achievement, because cultural studies' ongoing concern with power would ground it in radicalism and social movement energies. So Angie McRobbie, who was here the other day, responded very positively to this, for example. So in the late 90s, she called cultural policy the missing agenda, her expression, of cultural studies, because it offered a program for change, as per Stewart. Jim McGuigan, a prominent public sphere theorist of the media and old Trotskyite, welcomed this turn, provided that it retained radical insights by connecting to political economy's emphasis on public debate about citizenship rights. Here's a little picture of Stu, one of my dearest friends whom I deeply love. And due to my extraordinary artistic capacity, I've managed to produce it twice in different sizes. This took about 45 minutes this morning. Some people produce art the way Lisa Parks does. Some produce that. This is Stu being the intellectual. You know that moment when the man takes off his glasses and stares at the camera? This is it. So the glasses are now just twirled around the hand. This policy trend within cultural studies, which in many ways, as I'm suggesting, picked up on Hoggart's example, really took off first in late 1980s Australia. But interestingly enough, it involved both locals and a number of people who had fled Britain. They had fled Thatcherism, they'd fled the far right and the evisceration of radical jobs in UK universities. So it had strong ties to more conventional established protocols of cultural studies. And I'll just mention some names who were there at the time, apart from Stewart. Tom O'Regan, Tony Bennett, now back in Britain, David Saunders, now in France, Ian Hunter, and Colin Mercer, now back in Britain. What were their objects of analysis? The media, museums, copyright, pornography, schooling, and cultural precincts. What were their methods? Nutty theory, archival research, questionnaires, and a weird hybrid of Wittgenstein and Foucault that took the world to be rule-governed, whether cognizably so or otherwise. What they were really doing, though, that bound them together, was emphasizing the foundational nature of government in the creation of the liberal individual. Now, when I say the liberal individual, this is understood not as per US politics, right, but as per US education, i.e. the liberal individual as the person open to new ideas, provided they are delivered in a rational and reasoned manner. Okay? And instead of the liberal individual being somebody who naturally exists, which is what creative industries discourse thinks, which is what neoliberalism thinks, which is what, in my weaker moments, I have sometimes thought, the notion is that this liberal individual is constructed through the work of government, specifically through things like public education. Of course, this wasn't only happening in the English-speaking world and not only in Australia. In Latin America, these sorts of engagements were materializing in the work of such intellectuals as Roger Bartra, Nestor Garcia Canclini, and plenty of others. In Britain, cognate work was underway at the Greater London Council to encourage more inclusive definitions of culture. One might argue then that everything, when you get to the mid-90s, and this was also drawing a lot of interest in the US, despite the way that cultural policy appears to be irrelevant here. I'll get to that later. Everything, in a sense, seemed to be in accord with Hoggart's heritage and the yet more radical inspiration of Antonio Gramsci. Culture was deemed to be a terrain of struggle for hegemony, and there was a venerable German socialist rallying cry that was used. This was a 19th century German socialist rallying cry that a lot of us organized ourselves around, that a lot of librarians in the US from the 70s on organized around, namely the long march of the institutions, an expression that is often slated to Gramsci but actually precedes him by many decades. This is the long march of the institutions. We're on it here and now. It's also well before Mao's long march. So, how did this quite radical cultural policy studies slide into the much more reactionary creative industries discourse, much more reactionary from my perspective? Well, I want to suggest that the new turn has largely been a reaction to a new political economy, not a critique of a new political economy. By which I mean not the political economy of intellectual ideas, but the material political economy that we've been talking about at times. This shift away from the still political edge of cultural policy studies emerged in the here and now, in the hic et nunc, as we like to say, in the 21st century. Why? It was in response to the first world recognizing that its economic future lay in finance, capital, and ideology, rather than agriculture and manufacturing, and the third world seeking revenue from software and stories, not just minerals and masses. Changes in the media and associated knowledge technologies over this period have been likened by many critics from all points of the political spectrum, from all countries, to a new industrial revolution, with the impact of that and the Civil and Cold Wars kind of combined, but without there being the big bang of revolt. So these changes are touted in contemporary societies as a route to economic development as much as cultural or political expression. Between 1980 and 1998, annual world exchange of electronic culture grew from about $100 billion to $400 billion US. In 2003, these areas accounted, for example, for 2.3% of gross domestic product across the whole of Europe, to the tune of almost 700 billion euros, which is, just for points of comparison, more than the value of real estate, more than the value of food and drink, and equal to the value of chemicals, rubber, and plastics. I love mentioning rubber. The Intellectual Property Association, which is an international body but is a kind of front organization for the Motion Picture Association of America, the Intellectual Property Association estimates that copyright and patents are worth $400 billion a year in this country alone, which means they're worth more than aerospace, which has traditionally been the leader, more than automobiles, more than agriculture. And the cultural/copyright sector, it's called copyright sector here in the US, employs 12% of the workforce, which is up from 5% 50 years ago. PricewaterhouseCoopers says that annual growth across the world in this sector is 10% and likely to remain that way for the foreseeable future. So, US economic production in particular has been adjusting away from a farming and a manufacturing base, as I suggested the other day, to a cultural one, especially in foreign trade. It now sells feelings, ideas, money, health, insurance, laws, niche forms of identity, aka culture. The trend is to harness the cultural skills of the population to replace lost agricultural and manufacturing employment with jobs in music, theatre, animation, recording, radio, TV, architecture, software, all those categories that got bundled together in the different definitions that Kate was showing you yesterday. The British Academy, which is a peak national body of the great and the good in the human sciences in the UK, notes that, and I quote, "The dominant global industries of the past focused on manufacturing, but the key corporations of today are active in the fields of communications, information, entertainment, leisure," unquote. And here the US National Governors Association, the peak body of the governors of all the states, argues that, and I quote, innovative commercial businesses, non-profit institutions, and independent artists all have become necessary ingredients in a successful region's habitat. As we noted on Monday, right across this country, municipal, regional, and state funding agencies are dropping old funding and administrative categories of arts and crafts and replacing them with CI. The same thing is happening in Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. In 2006, Rwanda convened a global conference, notable, on the creative economy, the thing that the man in the funny old 30s bathing suit had announced at the University of Etcetera's. The declared intent was to take the social healing engendered by the experience of culture and commodify it in the interest of growth, drawing on non-Western ideas of creativity and development inside the growth paradigm. That's the Rwandan African model. Brazil houses the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, and the United Nations Development Programme's International Forum for Creative Industries, blending the two. So UNCTAD, which was the grand rebellious side of the UN against what was seen as the development of underdevelopment in the 50s and 60s, which was the third world's great voice for economic development in an independent sense in the UN, has become the key node of creative industries within that body. Even India's venerable last gasp of Nehruvianism, the much-beloved Planning Commission, has a committee for creative industries. And as we heard from Andrew and from Zhao, China is moving from an older, state-dominated focus on cultural industries towards a supposedly market-oriented pattern of creative industries. Such developments are in thrall to the idea that culture is an endlessly growing resource. To quote UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which when I was an undergrad was the hero of third worldists. To quote UNCTAD this century, creativity more than labor and capital or even traditional technologies is deeply embedded in every country's cultural context. So you've got the resource, everyone's got the resource, now commodify it. And Rwanda promises also a governmental impact, which is peace with economic development through creativity. In the case of the media, especially in this country, a great deal of technology, content, and personnel emerge from tertiary education, from universities. And this has offered humanities intellectuals who were already interested in cultural policy, originally perhaps for reasons of cultural nationalism or in opposition to exclusively market-driven culture, an opportunity to peer still closer at the heart of power. And the temptations for people in Western Europe, in Latin America, in the Asia-Pacific have been too much to resist. They have shifted their discourse to a comprehensively copyright-inflected one, focusing on the language of comparative advantage and competition, not the language of heritage and aesthetics. The neoliberal bequest of creativity has succeeded the old-school dirigiste patrimony of culture, because economic transformations have comprehensively challenged the idea of the humanities as removed from industry. Rather than working with, for example, the progressive goals of social democracy that use the state in that leftist march of the institutions that I announced earlier, this new development forms a kind of neoliberal mashup of them. So the British Academy valorizes cultural studies in the search to understand and further the creative and cultural industries. The Australian Research Council, national governmental body but doles out the lolly, which initially supported a major cultural policy initiative under the Gramscian turned Foucauldian Tony Bennett, now funds a Centre of Excellence for Creative Industries and Innovation run by a lapsed poet and Gerardian, Stewart, and a hitherto semiotic romantic, John Hartley, whom you'll hear from in a day or so. Even our own prosaic National Research Council of the US National Academies, which would surely never endorse the checkered pasts of my very good friends Stewart and John, even the NRC explains that studying the media from this perspective plays a crucial role in culture, offering personal, social, and educational benefit and economic development. New forms of cultural education are appearing that combine theory and practice, disobeying traditional disciplinary divisions. So here, multimedia design, corporate law, global flows of people, money, culture are part of everyday student talk and training in, for instance, gaming studies. California's 21st Century Literacy Summit notes that even as key channels of distribution are increasingly corporate, governmental, and narrow, the capacity to make and distribute stories and facts through the media is available as never before. If you go to the Australian Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences submission to Australia's National Productivity Commission, they talk about the new post-smokestack era of industry. They clearly hadn't been reading Rick's work. It's increasingly being recognized that in economic terms, the media in particular have become the leading edge of many export industries, that in political terms, they are central to democratic communication and the parliamentary process, and in cultural terms, they both incarnate and encourage social trends. This is the way the scene is surveyed by the Social Science Research Council here in the US, a non-governmental institution, a front organization of the Ford Foundation in the 50s to encourage area studies and be part of neo-colonialism in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and today a more independent body. So leave that up for a little while for you to read, just for a moment. So you might argue that media culture skirted the borders of academia in most countries 30 years ago. But a combination of public life and private consumption now compel a focus on it to an unparalleled extent, from discussions of globalization to accounts of everyday life, violence, education, family dynamics, artistic innovation, and economic restructuring. There are many indicators of this tendency. I'll just show you a few. Here are some different bodies, the NRC that I mentioned, National Research Council, the SSRC I've mentioned. All these bodies now think that we are onto something, and they want to support it, give it a piece of the pie in a way that never happened before, because of the payoff in well-behaved, obedient citizens and well-behaved, obedient, creative workers. And that's one group, set of groups that you can see there. And here's another set of groups. You can see it's right across the world. Now, a lot of this is obviously top-down stimulus. But as I indicated the other day, ties have also strengthened organically across SNOW's two cultures. I talked about how the engineers and the game designers sleep with the same people, take the same drugs, wear the same clothes, mingle. They're like the cats coming out of the bag in the Thomas Pynchon expression that I mentioned before. So isn't this a cosmic interdisciplinarity? Isn't this what those of us who believe in interdisciplinary projects welcome, and that is so often crowed about in the humanities? No, it isn't, because it's mostly interdisciplinarity without multiple natural languages, often without numbers, without ethnography, without geography, without experiments. This is something much more challenging than that kind of interdisciplinarity would be. This is the new humanities. This is the creative industries humanities. This is a response to a grand appeal, a great passion of the age. And again, to quote Pynchon, from him, even the most unreconstructed of Luddites can be charmed into laying down the old sledgehammer and stroking a few keys instead. In other words, they're lining up with technocrats, where technocrats are artists, are critics. Same person. Many of these maneuvers are enthralled to the creative industry approach of Richard Florida. Here is Richard with an unnamed assistant during one of his Baywatch-style tours of Australia. He's in the middle. One of his Baywatch-style tours of Australia at $40,000 an hour, that was the 06 rate. And here he is doing a creative makeover on the beach, I presume. The creative industry approach of Richard Florida and his business school acolytes who seek out the creative class that they claim is revitalizing post-industrial towns through a magic elixir that I mentioned on Monday last of technology, tolerance and talent as measured by the numbers of broadband connections, same-sex households and higher degrees. True believers in this putative liberation from corporate domination and cultural uniformity argue that the concept of the cultural industries is therefore outmoded because post-industrialized societies have seen an efflorescence of the creative sector via new technologies and small businesses. As they wander the globe promoting tertiary industry against agriculture and manufacturing, creative industry academics have become branded, merchandised surfboards. They descend on welcoming burghers who are eager to be made over at public expense by professors whose books appear on airport newsstands rather than on cloistered scholarly shelves. these carpetbagging consultants, many of them but not this dude, my friend, have sidestepped the historic tasks laid out by the left, striving instead to become organic intellectuals of this so-called creative class. Prone to cybertarianism, they are often gullible MIT light/MIT-like subscribers to digital capitalism and the technological sublime. There are three major groups. There are the Richard Floridians, riding around town on their bicycles to spy on ballet-loving, gay-friendly, multicultural computer geeks who have moved supposedly to deindustrialized, freezing rust belts. That's the first group. Then, as I mentioned the other day, there are the true believer Australian creationists who find even cultural policy studies too residually socialistic and textual for their taste. And, of course, what I forgot about the other day, there are the endlessly sprouting Brussels bureaucrats who offer blueprints to cities eager to be made over by culture and tolerance in search of affluence. It seems as though a makeover is underway, and here I quote Andrew Ross, from the rusty coinage of cultural industries to the newly minted creative ones. Well, this is interdisciplinarity, but does it fight against the tendency for ordinary people to be lost in the great anonymous sludge of history, where life, to trope Thomas Hobbes, is nasty, brutish, and short? And I'm actually there also troping C.P. Snow's original 57 pamphlet. Consider Pynchon's defense of old-style Luddites. This is a depiction of a Luddite from some centuries ago. Pynchon argues that they were in fact not protesting new technology at all. Rather, they were opposed to very well-established technology because it had led to job losses over 2 centuries. Ned Ludd was no technophobic crazy. Along with his followers, he recognized that men who did not do productive work controlled machinery which controlled the lives of those who did do productive work. Apropos, the very creative Lord Byron, whose love letters from female fans are being published this week, the very creative Lord Byron sought the death penalty for opponents of machines in his maiden speech in the British House of Lords. This was just months after summering with Percy and Mary Shelley, and just when the first Luddite piece of science fiction, aka Frankenstein, was being created by Mary. Fantastic intertextual link there that very few people would have been capable of making. It took me 4 years to work that out. The discourse of creative industries ignores such critical issues as the precariat/immaterial labour, which we heard about from Andrew, from George, from Angela, and so on, high-tech pollution, which we heard about from Ricky, and cultural imperialism, which we keep hearing about from me. Not to mention the need to define and analyse industries rather than celebrate them. For instance, when you think about the so-called post-manufacturing utopia, we've seen that the byproducts are not just code, they in fact are also smoke. The discourse of creative industries represents a key switching point, however, in an hourglass economy. What does that mean? It means one with increased inequality because of low-level, non-unionised positions. Why? And this again gets to the heart of Andrew's first talk. Because union protections that classically applied, for instance, to media workers here in the US, are displaced by a transfer of insecure conditions from the old arts sector in the name of two things: flexibility and fun stuff. People are pushed into the precariat, where jobs are part-time and multiple, where risk is intense, and where disparities in income are even more so. Well, when I talk to Floridian creationists about these things, and as I said, many of them are fellow travellers, they frequently admit that such critiques are at least partially true, but they maintain that the new media make consumers into producers, free the disabled from confinement, encourage new subjectivities, reward intellect and competitiveness, link people across cultures, and allow billions of flowers to bloom. It's a kind of post-political cornucopia, what I think of as a Marxist/Godardian wet dream. And here is a depiction of a wet dream. This is Katie Salamon's wet dream performance. If any of you haven't seen it, it's worth going to MySpace. That's, for those of you who've never had one, that's what a wet dream looks like. In this Marxist-Godardian wet dream, people fish, film, fuck, and write checks from morning to midnight. And the mass scale of the culture industries is progressively overrun by the individual talent of the creative sector. More dryly, in these dreams, it is thought that creative industries discourse is an inevitable response to the search of the humanities for relevance and influence, once it had encountered the search of post-industrial economies for innovation via culture. And the dreamers point to the organic convergence that I mentioned above between humanities folks and computing ones. But the great test that the Floridians, the creationists, and the culturecrats must sit and pass is bettering the quality of life. They may have shown that Luddites can reform themselves, that the humanities from the past can make things explode and make things go faster. But what have they done to cultural justice? So these are some of my concerns. I don't want to take up too much time, so I want to race ahead to a specific critique of the creative class idea. There's minimal proof for the existence of a creative class, or to support the assertion that creative cities outperform their drab brethren economically. Companies do seek skills when they're deciding where to locate their businesses, but skills also seek work. City centres, in fact, mostly attract workers who are young and not yet breeding. And the centrality of gay culture, of queer culture, in the Floridian calculus derives from his assumption that all same-sex households are queer. Now, university dorms and sorority/fraternity houses are not quite there, at least at the level of self-recognition. The idea that they are beacons of gay tolerance seems to me as absurd as his dressing up as a surfboard. And even if you would allow for all college towns being completely queer, many successful US cities are rolling with reaction. I mean, the most creative cities are Houston, Orlando, and Phoenix. The idea of urbanism incipient in US demographic statistics also happens, he doesn't really allow for this, to include the suburbs, which of course now hold more residents in this country than do the cities. So that too is a suspect figure in terms of the importance of downtown lofts to economies. And there's no evidence whatsoever of an overlap of tastes, of values, of living arrangements, of locations between, on the one hand, artists and on the other, accountants, despite the fact that they get bundled together in the creative concept. I guess Wallace Stevens worked for an insurance agency, right? So I guess, okay, that's two, and they're both dead. Nor is it sensible to assume other countries replicate the massive internal mobility of the US population. People move around here much more than they do in other industrialized countries. Finally, other surveys pour scorn on the claim that quality of life is really central to selecting business campuses. Why do the businesses go to their new campuses? They go because costs are low, communications technologies are good, markets are close by, and transportation is adequate. A European Commission evaluation of 29 so-called cities of culture, disclosed that their principal goal, economic growth stimulated by the public subvention of culture to renew failed cities, has itself failed. Glasgow in Scotland, for example, where I thought until June my mother was from, until I discovered that she'd never even been to Scotland, which she claimed to be her place of nationality. Glasgow, for instance, was initially hailed as a success of the programme, but many years after the rhetoric, there has been no sustained growth. This year, Kate's real hometown, Liverpool, became an official city of culture, I guess because they discovered the Beatles or something. Having allocated millions in public funds to an arts programme, a museum, galleries, a convention centre, a retail outlet, they even let Ringo Starr sing at the announcement, renewed transportation, rebuilt waterfront, every good thing, no? Premised on regeneration through culture. But skeptics are asking, is that a foundation strong enough to sustain a lasting economy, or is it the equivalent of pyramid selling, a fragile structure concealing a hollow emptiness at its heart? Across the continent, an endless pool of city bureaucrats and consultants make ever more desperate-sounding claims in order to distinguish their candidacies for this dubious moniker, European City of Culture. So Bristol, for example, in its application, talks about the fact that Cary Grant was born there. And I have this picture of Cary Grant when he was leaving Bristol. We know that Amar is going to Bristol for a cultural reassignment soon. That may well be how he is run out of town. If you look closely at the data for London, which is meant to be a creative city, they illustrate how the health of the creative industries is in fact a dependent variable. It is reliant on the health of, guess what? The financial sector, the City of London, along with New York, the most important world finance nexus. The upshot of creative industries discourse is that market objectives, in short, have overdetermined cultural ones. creative cities are creative ways of euphemizing gentrification for the urban middle class. So let's go back to Hoggart, Richard Hoggart. He wrote a memorable paper in the mid-60s called Higher Education and Cultural Change, in which he talked about how one of the virtues of the university has been its impurity, what David might have been talking about when he said a task of the humanities is translation, that the dirty hands that I spoke of are worth having because they are ways of connecting what could be an intensely elite institution to working people's concerns, and that it's right, to use Hoggart's words, that the life of ideas be tested against the life of choice and decision. But here is the question that he asks us to pose. We might use slightly different language in the 2000s. You could replace medieval historian or classicist with cultural studies professor, for example. And just so you know whom we're talking about, that's the old boy, now 91, and even his bedside lamp is falling apart. It's doing an impersonation of the Leaning Tower of Lamp. Well, in today's formation, anybody here read the work of Virginia Postrel at all? Virginia Postrel is an apologist for the Bush administration who claims that the economy is doing really well if you factor in the number of outlets for doing your fingernails, that they're left out of official economic statistics and they're growing all the time. Virginia Postrel is an economics journalist for the New York Times. She used to run Reason magazine, the libertarian magazine. She wrote a famous op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in 1999 in which she described cultural studies, she welcomed cultural studies as, and I quote, deeply threatening to traditional leftist views of commerce. It lends support to the corporate enemy and even trains graduate students who wind up doing market research, unquote. The question left to answer then is which sense of the public interest informs contemporary cultural policy studies versus creative industries discourse? I want to suggest there are lots of alternatives to this. I don't want to go on for much longer, so you could go to look at the, apologies for my poor pronunciations now and on previous and future occasions. Kultur macht Europa. How's that? Anybody who can speak German? No, not. Could you say it? Yes, that's a lot better. That thing. Thank you. Kultur macht Europa. No, okay. Go back to, rewind, Control Z, we're back to what she said, that thing. Has these federal congresses on cultural policy. It issued a fantastic declaration last year under that thing's name. There's also the Jodhpur Initiative for Promoting Cultural Industries in the Asia-Pacific region. It has a Jodhpur Consensus signed by 28 sovereign states in the Asia-Pacific that talks about the need, both these declarations talk about the need, not only for diverse distribution, which is fine for the CI people because it's good neoliberal ideas of competition, but also diverse textuality. And it both these declarations recognize that diverse textuality need not necessarily flow from diverse production and distribution. Right? If you want to stop certain norms, certain blocks of the world dominating the flow of texts, you have to measure that in part via what the texts are that get to people in large numbers, and not just via the number of channels that appear to be available, right? So, you know, if you look at what people actually watch online in the United States, they actually watch and read online things that are owned by the big media conglomerates and very little else. So, I also think that if you look across Latin America, you'll find some of the interdisciplinary cultural studies degrees that exist in Costa Rica, in Ecuador, and so on, very alive to these issues. If you look at some of the people who are doing critical cultural policy studies work, you can find an appreciation of this. You can find it with David Bell in Britain, Justin Lewis in Wales, Kate, Stefano Hani, George Udesi in Miami. Occasionally these people, because they actually get dirty hands, occasionally they weather slings and arrows from the comfortably pure ultra-left because they engage with commerce and the state. And occasionally they send rather mild missiles or missives of their own in the direction of those who, on the CI side, unproblematically embrace any and all such links. Okay, so I was going to talk about what's in the toolbox of doing a critical cultural policy studies that applies, you know, how you would go about doing it. But I'm a little worried about time. So I think what I'd like to do is just show you some of the slides rather than go through all of that, okay?
Can we have access to that part at some point?
Yes, yes, sure. So here are, I'll just go, so you know roughly what is in it. These are the things I think that people need to look at. Policy documents from both public and private bureaucracies, the debates that are available about questions, the budgets, where do these places get their money from, the laws, what is the enabling legislation, what are the debates and the bits of information that come up when there are legal cases, the history, the place, the people, and very much the pollution. And then here are some places you can actually go to do this. This is all coming out in a book, so that Blackwell's got coming out next month, I think. I list all these things. Because it's funny how often we get very restricted to one country or one discipline, and especially one language. And just to think about very quickly, you don't need to write them down, the number of journals that are available to help you do this work. Academic scholarly journals. If you go and look at what most creative industries academics cite, it's only websites. It's reports and websites. There is no other knowledge. Well, there is other knowledge, and this is some of it. And it's often in different languages. And that's another reason for doing work in research teams. You need people who speak different languages, come from and live in other countries, if you're going to do good work, in my opinion. And to help you with that, there are lots and lots of professional associations you can connect to. These are ones simply that study the media, and they're from all over the world, as you can see. They almost all welcome people who don't live in the regions that they cover. Lots of them provide at least some services in English, lots of them obviously in other languages. If you don't know about these professional associations, if you only know the one that's relevant to you, you're not in the game. And that's Billy Bragg. Well, it's interesting. In order to find a Billy Bragg photo that was appealing, I had to go back to the 1980s. So this actually is 80s Billy Bragg. Yeah, I know. The name of this slide is something like 80s Billy Bragg, and I thought, yeah, that was our decade, buddy. So the reason I have this, this is my second last slide, is because he has a song that some of you may know called Tear Down the Union Jack, where he laments, and he refers to the great and the good that I talked about earlier. He laments the passing of the great and the good by what he calls the greedy and the mean in england.co.uk. There is, of course, an alternative to this, and it's us. There we are, managing to frame and at the same time disestablish one of the great buildings of the creative sector. So, thanks a lot.